Looking for the perfect way to finish your project? Today I'm using the Creative Quilt Bindings Template to put simple and fancy bindings on different projects. Ready? Let's get started. The Creative Quilt Bindings Template, along with a Creative Quilt Bindings Template book, is what we'll be using for a lot of the tips and tricks that I'm going to show you today. If you are cutting a straight binding, you can just line up the edge of your ruler with the edge of your fabric. Make sure you keep your fingers out of the way and cut. However, there's a great technique for cutting a bias binding, and there's a magic way that you can fold your fabric. Take your fabric, selvage edge towards you, and the other selvage edge away from you. I always cut off my selvages to use them in selvage quilts. Fold left to the right, and then to the right again, making sure to line up all these edges. Then fold down your top, and you have a piece that's ready to cut. I'm going to go ahead and trim off my end here. Flip it back around. I'm going to choose what kind of binding I'm doing. I'll just do a traditional binding. And just like that, I have bias cut strips without having to worry about any fancy angles at all. Once you have your strips cut, you need to stitch them together to make your long binding strip. Take one strip, lay the other strip on top, and sew from where the corners meet to where the corners meet. Now you want to trim off your end, cutting flush with the fabric, 1/4 inch away, and then flush with your fabric again. Press all of your binding seams open. Regardless of your favorite way to press seams in quilting, in binding, we always want to press them open because that reduces the bulk. If you pressed your binding seam to the side, you would have 3 layers to sew through. Except when you folded it over and then over again and had it on your quilt as binding, you now have a super lumpy area on your quilt. So that's why we always press our binding seams open to reduce that bulk and spread it out as much as possible. Once you have your long binding strip, it's time to press it in half. Simply fold it in half, lining up the edge, and press. If it's a bias binding strip like this one, try not to stretch it out while you press. Just repeat all the way along the entire length of your strip. When you're trimming up your quilt to prepare it for binding, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. You're going to be stitching your binding 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. If you have points, you want to make sure that you give yourself at least 1/4 inch of room to do that. If your quilt has a border, you'll have plenty of space and you don't need to worry. But when you have points like this, you want to make sure that you give yourself at least 1/4 inch. So line up your edge. make sure you have 1/4 inch. If you have more space on your quilt, you can always give yourself a little more room, 1/2 inch, and that'll give me 1/4 inch of background fabric before my binding starts, giving myself a little bit of a border. And just repeat that process all the way around your quilt, trimming and squaring it up before putting on the binding. Before you stitch on your binding, you want to do a test fit. If you want, you can pin, but you don't have to. The most important thing is to go all the way around your quilt, putting your corners where your corners are going to be, and checking for one thing. And the thing that we're checking for is to make sure that we don't have a seam where our corners are going to be. For example, I have a seam right here, which has that extra bulk. If my corner landed here with that seam right in the corner, I'd have the extra bulk of the corner and the extra bulk of the seam all at the same time, and it's really hard to get a nice corner with all that extra bulk. So if I saw this happen, I'd want to move it up and then do my test fit again all the way around the quilt to make sure that I don't have any of these extra seams in those corners. Once you've done your test fit, you're ready to take it to the sewing machine. You want to give yourself at least 8 inches of space from where you start to where you finish. I'm just using my regular 1/4 inch foot. And stitching all the way down to the end. It's all straight stitching except for the corners. Here's how we do a corner. Fold away from the quilt, finger press, hold, fold back towards the quilt, finger press. Then take this flap and move it out of the way for the stitching that's coming your direction. Stitch all the way up to your fold, which should be 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. Give yourself a couple stitches back and forth just to secure that corner. Lift your needle up, lift your presser foot up, and then pivot. Now we're going to move that flap back out of the way. Put the presser foot down, couple stitches forward, couple stitches back, and continue on our way. A standard quilt has 4 corners, so you just need to do that 4 times, and by the end, you'll be a pro. Stitch your binding all the way around your quilt, and then we're ready to join our ends. If you've ever joined quilt binding, you might think that it's an absolute pain, but I'm going to show you a tip that's going to make this super easy. Start by matching up your 2 ends. Make sure they're nice and matched up. And then give these a good crease. Now move one out of the way. And we're starting with the right hand side. We're going to take that crease we made and using our Creative Quilt Bindings Template, there is a fold mark line right here, and there's a reference guide right here that says top right. So top right is right side up for me, so I'm using this template correctly. Match up this top right. The fold line is on the fold line. Then I'm just going to use a fabric marking pen right on the edge, making sure not to mark on my quilt top. And I've marked my line. Since I already have this out, I can just go ahead and cut on the line that I just drew. This end right here is really magical because I've now cut off my dog ear already, and this is going to help me line up my edges. Now I've got my second piece and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Open it up, lay it flat. And I'm going to take this ruler and I'm just going to flip it 180 degrees. Line it up with my fold line. And my bottom left is now right side up. Mark it with my marking pen and cut it with my scissors. Now, if you're nervous about what you just did, you can check before making this cut, but I already know that they're going to line up just right with my seam allowances. So now I can take my quilt, bring the edges of my binding together, and because those dog ears are cut, you'll see that everything lines right up. I'm just going to add a couple pins and then I can take it to my sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam right on this line. You'll want to finger press your seam open. Again, we're going to reduce that bulk by pressing our seams open instead of to the side. And if you look, our binding fits just perfectly. Now we can just stitch down the rest of this binding. And our binding is stitched onto the front of our quilt. Now that you have your binding sewn to the front of your quilt, we're going to flip it over and stitch it to the back. Fold over the quilt binding to the back, and you can use these fantastic little clips to clip it in place. When you're doing a big quilt, you don't have to worry about having enough clips to go all the way around. You can just clip as many clips as you have, stitch that part, and then clip the rest. When you get to a corner, you want to clip this thread that jumps from one side to the other. Fold your corner towards the side that you're coming from and flip it over. This is going to give you a nice crisp point on the front. Now bring it over to the back and make it flat in the direction that you're going. Flip this up. And clip. And then you can keep clipping all the way around. If you've done your corner right, you'll have a nice crisp point on the front and a nice clean point on the back with the corners matching. If it doesn't look right, just undo it and do it again. It's better to get it right now before you stitch than try to get frustrated with it when you're stitching. You want to load your needle with a thread that matches your binding. In this case, I went with a blue. It'll match my binding a little bit, but really I want you to be able to see the stitches. If I was binding this in a more hidden color, I'd probably pick either this cream or a light gray. You want to bury your tail by coming in from a little ways away. And now the tail of your thread is going to be hidden in the seam allowance of the binding. And also in the seam allowance, just do 3 quick stitches. This is more secure than a knot and won't give you the bulk that a knot does. And also because this is happening in the seam allowance, it's tucked away. Now fold your quilt binding back. And you're just going to grab a couple threads within your binding. And then in the exact same spot on the back of your quilt, move forward. You don't want your stitching to come to the front of your quilt. You're just grabbing the fabric of that quilt backing. Now in the same spot that you came up, grab a couple threads of your binding and repeat this process, moving forward just a little bit each time. With tiny stitches and matching thread, this becomes virtually invisible. When you get to a clip, you can just move it out of your way. If I'm working on binding on a car trip or on the couch, rather than moving my clip out of the way, I just clip it on a spot on my quilt where it's out of my way, and that way I have them all handy when it's time to add more clips to my quilt. You can keep stitching until you finish and get to the end, or you run out of thread. If you run out of thread, you want to give yourself at least 6 inches of thread before you completely run out. Do your last stitch, and then you want to do 3 small stitches in place right in this spot. If you want to make sure that there's a knot in there, in one of your loops, just put the thread through the loop, and now you've got a knot in there. Once your end is secure, go just through this backing fabric, bring your thread away, give the thread a little tug to make it tight, clip, and now the end of your thread is buried. And that's how you hand stitch on your binding. With the Creative Quilt Bindings template, there are different marks that allow you to make different kinds of binding. For example, this binding is the reversible binding, so it was cut using the blue marks. I stitched the 2 pieces together, and then you press your seams open before you fold it in half, which looks like this. Then you stitch it to your quilt, and when you stitch it on, you'll have red binding on the back and white binding on the front. Super simple. The flange binding is done similarly, cutting the 2 different pieces. Here, before pressing in half, you press towards your flange, and it gets stitched to the back of the quilt, like so. So when it flips over to the front, take it to your sewing machine and stitch right in the ditch between the 2 fabrics. The mock piping binding is done similarly, cutting the 2 different pieces using the green lines on the Creative Quilt Bindings template, and it gets stitched to the back of the quilt, like so. Bring the binding to the front and clip it with your clips. For both the mock piping and the flange binding, they're getting attached to the back and then clipped to the front. For your corners, clip the thread, fold the seam allowance towards the direction you're coming from, then flip it over, fold coming from the direction that you're coming from, and then flip this up. If you're having trouble flipping this up to get a sharp point, a trick is to just use a pin, put it in place, and flip over your pin. Then clip. And keep clipping all the way around your quilt. To stitch both the mock piping and the flange binding, we're stitching right onto the front of the quilt. Just take it to your sewing machine and stitch right in the ditch between the two fabrics. You'll stitch like that all the way around. When you're done, you'll have a quilt that looks like this. And that's how easy it is to dress up the bindings of your quilt. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel.